This is the article 10 Things Wrong with All My First Drafts by myself, Jay Wilburn. Again, LitReactor.com is a great resource for writing articles and essays and all sorts of interesting things. So let's see if my article can live up to that standard. Toward the end of 2020, I decided to make a concerted effort to catalog all the stories I'd ever written, from flash fiction to novel-length works. I wanted to know the submission and publishing histories of everything I'd written. It's an ongoing process that may warrant its own article. Not counting ghostwritten work, it came out to over 400 stories. Including ghostwriting, it's over 1,000 stories. So I've put some words in. I had to open each file to get word counts and, in more than a few cases, to remind myself what the story was about. Then I had to be sure it was my story and not one I'd written for somebody else with ghostwriting. There's something unnerving about finding a 9,000 word story I have no memory of writing and trying to figure out what it is. In a few instances, I was pleased to find old gems that I'd forgotten and were even better than I remembered. In a number of other examples, finding a story I'd written a decade ago that had been rejected 4 times was an exercise in self-torture. I can't believe I let 4 people read this terrible story. I've gotten better over the years, especially in the years I've written full-time. It would have been difficult to get worse than a 9,000 word story with no beginning, middle, or end. I sent that to 4 editors I hope have long forgotten it and me. One of the biggest differences between then and now, beyond a better understanding of what makes a story work, is the improvement between my first and final drafts. Bad habits shift over time and some get cast aside permanently, but there are some common elements in all my first drafts that were illustrated in stark terms by cataloging my writing. These are the 10 problems I seem to need to fix in all my first drafts. Now, I could have gone way more than 10, but I'll limit my self-torture to just these 10, and these are the ones that kind of show up a lot. I imagine other writers can relate to these as well. Number 1, repeated words. By this, I do not mean doubling up a word as I'm typing, as in like writing the 2 times in a row. That typo happens too. I mean having a lot of characters looking in a story. If I'm not conscious of it, I use the word back a ridiculous number of times. It is worse with the more obscure words that I get obsessed with and start throwing into stories multiple times in a row. Those special words stand out. So that's what I mean by repeated words. In On Writing, Stephen King mentions the word zest and a terrible short story he read by another author who couldn't stop using it. King said he didn't believe he had used zest in any of his stories. Then I found it in Salem's Lot. Then I found it in 2 other novels. Just 1 use each, though. If he hadn't mentioned it, I wouldn't have noticed. King does have a tendency to fixate on a word that will show up in a few novels in a row before drifting out of use. His zest is probably the word obdurate. It shows up a ton in 11/22/63, but that was purposeful. In that book, he used obdurate to describe how time kind of protects itself. So when a person tries to change time in that particular novel, the past is obdurate and won't allow it resists changes, although changes can be made. It shows up in a lot of earlier novels too and stands out because it's an obscure word. It doesn't fly by the eyes like "the" does. I'm no Stephen King, but I have to edit out clusters of zests and obdurates that find their way into my own first drafts. Second thing in all my first drafts, omitted words. This is one of the most common typos for most people. You think the word, but while typing quickly, you don't type the word before moving on to the next word in the sentence. Not a problem as long as you find it before you put it in readers' hands. Also, this is one of many arguments for beta readers, proofreaders, and professional editors. This is the one error your brain is least likely to see the more times you read over your own work. So as you're editing yourself, the typo that's least likely for you to catch in your own story is the missing word. So your brain just kind of substitutes it into the sentence where you've left it out, whereas a professional editor or sometimes another reader is more likely to pick up on that. And the more times you read over your work, the less likely you are to see that error. As I've been doing live writings on Twitch, this has been illustrated for me right before my eyes. When I edit the videos of the initial streams, I'll literally watch and hear myself say the word as I'm speaking the story out loud to viewers, but then watch myself not type that word in the middle of the sentence. It happens most often when I go back to change a piece of a sentence that wasn't quite right for me. I'm particularly prone to omit words when micro-editing while drafting. So that mistake comes up a lot when I kind of go back and try to fix a sentence. And a lot of people probably notice that a lot with their Facebook posts and things like that. If you go back and are trying to rewrite it, sometimes you'll post something and realize it doesn't make any sense at all because you changed part of one sentence into another sentence. So you kind of have the mix of the two sentences there, and sometimes omitted words as well. Number 3, most common, unconnected themes. This isn't a bad one. Hey man, thanks for dropping in. Unconnected themes. This isn't a bad one, but it points to the value of rewrites. As I'm writing a story of any length, but especially in longer works like novels and novellas, I won't realize a theme, a bit of symbolism, or a callback in the story until I'm revisiting it. I'll see that a color or an emotional tone is sprinkled through the story, but just hasn't been connected together to make the most of it thematically. Usually I'll pick up on it in the second draft and get it just right in the third. Then it looks like I knew it was there all along in the final draft. I forget words as I'm writing a sentence too. It makes me feel better. Yeah, I think we can all commiserate on this a little bit. Like I said, there's a ton of others I could have added in on this, but LitReactor doesn't want me writing 40-point lists here. All right, missing setup. Number 4. I'm not always a pantser, writing by the seat of my pants without an outline, but I am a pantser a lot, especially with short stories. As a result, I'll introduce elements late in a story that have to be set up earlier to really be justified. That has to be done in the editing. Certain character choices or traits will be significant at the end of the story in the first draft, so I have to establish hints of those traits early in the second draft to make them work for the reader. Again, even though you wouldn't necessarily call this a mistake, it is something wrong with the first draft that kind of has to be fixed before you move on to the second. All right, number 5, wandering words. Max Booth III is an excellent author and publisher who is big on the idea of starting the story in the right place. He believes authors often start their stories too soon as they wander through setup before finally getting to the real action. His suggestion is to start cutting from the front of the story while editing. Could you start with the second paragraph instead of the first? Could you start with the third instead of the second? Keep cutting until you get to the first bit of story that cannot be cut. That's where the story begins. If you keep cutting all the way through the story until the end, you're in trouble. I sent that 9,000 word story to 4 different editors. There's always extra words and passages wandering away from the story and the action that need to be cut from my first drafts. I've gotten better about my beginnings, but I still start there. Too much description about a particular thing sometimes needs to be cut down to one sharp line. Too much of a character's thoughts need to be abbreviated or displayed through their face or actions. All right, number 6, and this is one that I'm going to need to watch for in the story I'm about to edit because, again, I do this every time. Number 6, thing wrong with all my first drafts: smell, feel, and taste. I have plenty of sight and sound in every first draft, but I'm often missing the details that really immerse the character in the world. I'm getting better about it, but I miss details from the other senses in my first draft, and solving a flat first draft for me is often helped by expanding the sensory input in the second draft. All right, number 7, the wrong name. I fixed this a little bit with a little bit more pre-writing, but it's still a thing I got to watch for. This one isn't dire and is mostly an issue of personal preference, but I changed names a good bit from the first draft to the final draft. In the fury of the first draft, I'll gravitate toward the same names for people, streets, towns, etc. Upon editing, I can usually do better with a few of those names. I put together a short story collection a while back. The stories ranged from near the beginning of my writing career to the present. As I edited them again in order, I found the name Jeff in several stories. Over a decade of writing, you miss how often Jeff stops by for a story. In my case, Jeff had clearly overstayed his welcome. I limited myself to one Jeff in the collection. I missed one name change for Jeff in one of the other stories, and the editor's note upon finding that error was, "Who the hell is Jeff?" Indeed, who the hell is Jeff? That's kind of become an ongoing joke with some of my friends because I brought it up about that. And again, in one of the stories that had a Jeff in it, I changed it, but I'd left the character's name as Jeff in one place, so of course the editor didn't know what was going on. And again, glad the editor caught it, or that would have been quite confusing to put out there. All right, number 8 is head hopping, and this is one that I is kind of a burr for me because I end up doing it a good bit if I don't watch myself. And again, I've seen bigger authors do this as well, but they won't let me get away with it. So number 8, head hopping. This is the idea of staying with one perspective character in a story or one per scene or chapter. You as the reader don't get access to the thoughts of one character and then drift into the head of another during the scene, even an omniscient third-person perspective. That is head hopping if you move between characters like that when you're talking about their thoughts. The difference between head hopping and omniscient voice is that omniscient voice would not give the second character's thoughts in the second character's voice. Some editors and publishers still consider that head hopping if there's not a clear break in the scene. So supposedly with omniscient voice, you can have the omniscient narrator move between people's heads and know what they're thinking, but it can't be sometimes what I call omniscient sympathetic, where even though it's a third person outside of the scene that's telling the story, it sounds like that person's voice as it's saying it. So a lot of times, even when you don't do that, editors will still call it head hopping. They're pretty sensitive about it, so you can't get away with it like writers in the 70s and 80s used to, I guess. All right, this isn't literally in all my first drafts, but I have to watch for it. I'm still not convinced this doesn't have its place in storytelling, but editors will stop talking to me if I keep doing it, so I make an effort to fix it. I actually wrote a story called Head Hopping, where this demon presence keeps jumping between people's heads and kind of using their thoughts and memories and voices to escape the people that are hunting it. So I kind of created a story format that allowed for head hopping. I don't know if it works, but I guess it's kind of my Andy Kaufman-esque sort of pushback against that. Number 9, sentence variation. I'm not nearly as bad about this as I was in the past. I had a tendency to lock into the same sentence structure over and over, and it created a bad rhythm for the story. I especially did it when I was in an action scene and was writing it quickly. In every first draft, there's usually a section where I have to change up a few sentences in the middle so that they aren't all the same. And then lastly, number 10, more punch needed on the ending. You have to stick the landing. Sometimes I'll have the right ending. It's a good ending, but it doesn't quite have all the power it could deliver. Many times the fix is subtle. An extra line or a rewording of the last line does it. It can be something adjusted in the paragraph or two before the ending so that the last lines land stronger. I don't have to rewrite every ending of every story, but there is almost always a little adjustment needed in the edits. I try to be fearless with my first drafts. I don't let fear of getting it wrong get in the way of me focusing on the story and getting it all down as best I can. I understand in doing it this way, I need to be prepared to do some heavy lifting in the edits. It's not always a mess in the first draft, but there is always work to be done. Knowing myself as a writer means picking up on my bad habits enough to catch them in the revision phase. Over time, that awareness sinks in and it becomes subconscious, allowing me to avoid those things more without breaking the flow of drafting. There will always be things wrong in my first drafts, but that's part of the process.